the grandson of the chairman of the most powerful and largest in the country, uniting diversified companies, the TK Group Corporation, Sean Toller, part-time, the Duke of Stanningham, Chester Toller, as they said, was accustomed to luxury and power from the cradle. In addition to the title bought by his grandfather, this darling of fate inherited both the Duke's beautiful face and his courageous figure. And of course, he loved to emphasize them with the best clothes and the most status accessories. It is not surprising to conclude that Toller, who was in the prime of his life, enjoyed all or almost all the beauties he met. But he had a heart, and it belonged to one single girl. The chosen one from a much lower status family could not resist when the Duke proposed marriage to her and burst into tears of happiness because she considered Chester the ideal guy and simply idolized him. But it must be said that in business, Chester Toller overtook all competitors, taking the post of director of the strategic planning department at TK Group and becoming the official successor of his grandfather. The press in every way praised the talents of Toller the grandson, as well as his good appearance. And now it began to buzz that Mr. Toller had exchanged his family business for an affair with a simple girl, an employee of an advertising company collaborating with TK Group. Chester's younger cousin, executive director of the production department of the same concern, 34-year-old Luke, was furious and dismayed that his cousin was being promoted so much in print media. He hoped that it was all just gossip, but still he got very drunk. Intoxicated, he was haunted by the thought that his cousin was a scoundrel, doing whatever he wanted and pushing him, Luke, into the background. In the vain hope that the information from the print media would be refuted on television, Toller Jr. turned on the news. Even worse, they compared the two cousins as competitors and talked about Luke's crushing defeat against the backdrop of Chester's successes. Unbearable humiliation, Luke sobbed and vowed to destroy everyone. Let's fast forward to the tiny restaurant of the Kenny family, where a celebration was recently held in honor of the appointment of the eldest daughter, May, as deputy director of the technology department of the same TK Group Corporation. When 10 years ago, May first appeared before her relatives in a skirt suit that was not cheap by their standards, very suitable for a beginning career woman in a large company, and moreover, favorably emphasizing all the curves of the body. Her family was delighted. The mother gasped that the expensive clothes made her daughter incredibly beautiful. The younger brothers screamed that she was cool and just like an adult. May herself thought that the suit was a good purchase, and its cost was not that great, considering how long it would last. Then the young career woman doubted herself and decided in a panic that she would be kicked out immediately after the probationary period. But her mother began to give her advice on how to hold out at work and not turn her colleagues and bosses against her. The wise woman explained that adult life is really cruel. There are overwork, violations of work ethics, even bullying of unwanted people. So the main thing is to keep 3 rules in mind. Do not contradict your superiors, say what others like, and smile. And just 10 years later, the hard-working, active, and lavishly charming Miss Kenny, former #1 in high school and now a valuable asset, #1 in both customer service and team building, head of training classes, has reached a very high position in technology department. The youngest woman to become deputy director, people joked about her out of envy that she was an artificial intelligence developed by TK Group. And so, standing in front of the director of the strategic planning department, the eldest son of the chairman of the corporation, May Kenny heard with trembling knees that she had been demoted. Mr. Chester Toller informed Kenny that she was now the secretary and right-hand man of his cousin, the executive director of the concern's manufacturing department, Luke Toller. May couldn't believe her ears because she was in a leadership position, and now she had to become a simple secretary. With tears in her eyes, the woman thought that she had worked like a horse for so many years, and for what? For the sake of such a sudden demotion. In response to Miss Kenny's pleas to point out what her mistakes were and promises to fix everything, the head son said that she was an ideal employee, and he himself did not want to miss such an employee. However, the boss explained, she is the only one in the entire corporation who seems capable of dealing with his cousin. Chester Toller sweetened this strange justification for layoffs with the promise of a very good offer from Sunray, a symbol of the U.S. business community. This place, surrounded by mighty pines and cedars so densely that even the sun's rays breaking through their branches looked harsh, was the family mansion of Sean Toller. That is, the messages from Sunray were direct orders from the head of the TK Group himself. Amazed, May Kenny realized that either the biggest chance or the biggest crisis had come into her life, and that there was nowhere to retreat. And at this time, the plane with that same cousin on board was flying to New York. Luke Toller successfully landed at the airport after an international flight. Carrying a light suitcase and carrying several shopping bags from expensive brands, he walked slowly in flip-flops and a fashionable Hawaiian shirt over a new t-shirt. Tanned, handsome as Apollo, happy and with a travel pillow around his neck, Luke was thinking about anything but work. But suddenly, the fashionista's attention was attracted by someone's loud but respectful call. It was his assistant John Kemp, or in simple terms, Driver Kemp. The dutiful and amiable John accepted his boss's belongings, inquired how the flight had gone, and suggested as a compliment that Mr. Toller had worked hard on the business trip. However, the business trip was only an excuse for the youngest grandson of the head of the TK Group concern. In fact, he went to have fun. He considered it necessary to let off steam after a long, non-stop work. Luke Toller aspired to become the master of Sunray himself and believed that his cousin, a real bastard, had him on the hook. Upset by such injustice, Luke decided that then let the corporation cope without him, which is why he went on a business trip so abruptly, to the horror of his cousin. So now the driver was ordered to take his patron from the airport straight to the head office of the concern, to the department that Chester was in charge of, which discouraged Luke, who wanted to take a break from the road. The call from the cousin completely enraged the pseudo-businessman and was dismissed with a quick movement of his finger. Toller Jr. dozed off in traffic, but was awakened by another phone call, which his assistant was hesitant to answer or reset himself, since it was the number of May Kenny, who was still considered the deputy director. Luke was disheartened by the call, but even more so by the news that May had been removed from her leadership position and appointed as his personal assistant and secretary. The new assistant said that Mr. Toller could ask his cousin about it himself, but Luke decided that May was simply pranking him and hung up. When Kenny reported this to the director of the Strategic Planning Department, he angrily, but at the same time, slyly narrowed his eyes and ordered her to continue to carry out everything planned according to the schedule. The executive director of the production department of the TK Group Corporation, Luke Toller, lived in the most elite area of New York Hudson Yards, in a luxurious skyscraper near Hudson Park. Entering the huge designer apartment, Luke immediately took off his clothes, quickly washed off the road dust in the shower, fell onto the double bed, and fell asleep overnight. He, of course, forgot to lock the door. In the dream, our traveler, a muscle man, it must be said, returned to the pleasures of his pseudo-business trip, to warm azure waves, surfing, shopping, nightly parties in clubs, and sultry beauties ready for anything. But a telephone call abruptly jerked Mr. Toller out of his sweet oblivion and plunged him into real horror. Assistant Kemp appeared to hang around at his door and in a confused voice begged to enter. And with him, one of the TK Group deputies would not allow him to rest from the road. Shaking off the remnants of sleep and barely containing his rage, the executive director, sitting on the bed in his shorts, invited only his deputy to enter and did not think at all about his appearance. The deputy took the phone from the driver. Damn, it's the same prankster from the technology department, May Kenny, that she might need. Angrily wondering why Miss Kenny showed up when she was supposed to be at work at the company, Toller Jr. could not restrain himself and yelled at May, asking why the hell she left at his door. The confirmation that Kenny was no longer a deputy in the technology department, but on orders from Sunray, his own secretary, or perhaps assistant, left Luke Toller in shock. May showed impudence and burst in, using the unlocked door, saying that she had little time. She did not listen to the objections of her new boss. I must say that Luke had a lot to look at besides his biceps. He didn't have time to get dressed at all. He even managed to plop down on the floor while trying to pull on his trousers, but he had already gotten up. The executive director was overcome with shame and anger, appearing in a negligee in front of an impudent subordinate. She, embarrassed, left, but nevertheless managed to examine Toller from head to toe, and closing the door, kept returning her gaze to what she saw. Finally, the grandson of the head and executive director of the largest corporation in the country came out to his subordinates in home clothes, a t-shirt and shorts. Having learned that he had to leave in 15 minutes, he first grabbed his head, then grimaced and said that he was not ready and had not yet washed himself or had breakfast. As it turned out, the assistants had prepared office clothes for him in advance. We also ordered sandwiches and coffee. Luke was a little confused and at the same time indignant, since he did not eat most types of sandwiches, but they brought him exactly the right one, with ham, cheese, and egg, without vegetables. Of course, it was a desire to curry favor, but it was so reminiscent of concern. Luke was touched, but also wary. This new secretary would find out everything everywhere, and she was also as assertive as a tank. Annoying. And she, it seems, could not get out of her role as a deputy, because in a self-confident tone, she continued that in the car, she would tell her in more detail about the situation and the schedule for today. The executive director exploded, even though Kenny is his personal assistant. But to come so suddenly, to burst into the apartment without an invitation, is rudeness. He can even walk around here naked. This is a private space. Toller Jr.'s voice sounded furious, but there were also playful notes in the words about the lack of clothes. May widened her eyes and stammered whether it was because the executive director was uncomfortable appearing naked in front of her because she was a girl. The oligarch's grandson first fell into a stupor, then burst into laughter and said that Kenny had gone crazy. The subordinate tried to smooth things over by saying that the director seemed comfortable with her because he was laughing and that she was happy about it, and then reminded her that there were 10 minutes left before she left. He and Deputy Kemp assumed that Mr. Toller would not have enough time to shower, so they prepared a wet towel in advance. These two were really going to wash Luke, right on the staircase, shamelessly to the point of disgrace. The secretary, moreover, began to speak familiarly. Toller could not stand this and shouted that the cleaning equipment should be removed from him, and that everything that was happening irritated him. The assistants obeyed and now stood before the boss, confused, although they did not seem to fully realize their mistake, especially Miss Kenny. Luke Toller was angry, but looking at the former deputy from the technology department, and now his secretary, he gradually softened, although he scolded himself for it. May dressed unfashionably and gloomily, but according to her figure, and not for the first time Luke caught himself wanting to look at her, and the look of this young woman seemed dog-like. Although, as Toller Jr. reasoned, the facial expressions and tone of voice of the former deputy were always restrained and monotonous, even when she was rude today and then apologized, so there is no need to make up nonsense. And why bother with the ill-mannered secretary at all? Kick her out if she continues like this, and that's all, the boss decided. But for now, he told her and the driver to wait 5 minutes while he washed himself. The subordinates expressed their willingness to wait, with Kenny looking excited, while Kemp seemed uncomfortable, but it also seemed that the driver was being cunning and playing some kind of game. The boss didn't like all this, and was especially irritated by May from their first meeting 10 years ago, when they came to the TK Group Training Center as trainees, and this girl immediately showed herself to be an upstart, and moreover, a bore. Since then, Miss Kenny has not changed at all. The same long brown hair, often in a ponytail, the same boring glasses, and the same black two-piece suit, when she has time to wash it, if she wears it every day. A recognized fashionista, Toller was surprised how you could wear the same style for 10 years, although this stupid suit emphasizes your chest well, but you need to somehow follow modern trends. Luke remembered the announcement of the best trainees of the 53rd edition, the selected employees of the TK Group. May then overtook him, taking first place. Although the second is also not bad, it's a shame, because the future executive director worked so hard not to be ashamed of being called the successor of TK Group. But then his brother was sharply overtaken, which is even more offensive. But since childhood, Luke tried to meet the expectations of his environment, was the best in mathematics in high school, and always heard about his talent. At school and at the university, he was the best in the academic rankings. Bringing his father bad grades would have been a disgrace for him, and achieving his father's praise took enormous effort. Graduating from Harvard with honors was also not easy, but Luke never gave up the championship to anyone. And suddenly, taking second place among the trainees of your own grandfather's company is an indelible shame. I wanted to kill that trash May Kenny, really. I also wanted to drag her into bed. But who was she anyway? The daughter of the owners of some small restaurant, an arrogant girl in a boring knee-length skirt. And she wasn't even surprised that she won. All that was left was to clench his fists. This is what the grandson of oligarch Sean Toller thought as he dried his hair, standing in front of the mirror in his trousers, with toiletries and family photographs on the designer table in front of him. The secretary knocked this time, and Toller Jr. sarcastically asked if he had done it in 5 minutes, and Kenny complimented him on his speed. Although this nerd may have looked at Luke's athletic torso and had an amazing attitude about the timing, but the word was spoken in a robotic tone. The director looked into the eyes of the assistant and once again noticed that they were like gray-blue oceans. But their dog-like expression was embarrassing, as if this woman was currying favor even with her glance, and it would be worth throwing away her glasses. Putting a shirt on his powerful body, the handsome man was mentally indignant at the fact that this boa constrictor in a skirt was assigned to him, and at the same time wondered how an activist who knew everything about everything could be so demoted. Luke turned to May, calling her, in the old way, deputy, and harshly said that he could not stand assistance. He was clingy. The secretary was confused, but was able to gather her courage and answer that she would try to please. Looking over his shoulder at May, the production manager slowly but proudly said that he usually tolerated people he hated well, but that this would not work with the new assistant. Turning a little harder and fastening his expensive watch, Luke Toller, pronouncing the words clearly and separately, called the secretary by first and last name and said that he hated her. Leaning towards May, Toller Jr. explained that he hated her from the moment they were assigned to the same group at the training center, and also demanded that she quietly surrender and resign from her current position. As he spoke, Luke first devoured the lips and graceful neck of his assistant, moved his greedy eyes down to her slender legs as far as they could be seen, then up again to her plump breasts. He looked at the tablet tightly clutched to his chest, at his thin, long fingers and graceful wrists. Suddenly, May Kenny announced that the timing was 7 minutes ahead, but that it was time to move forward. Toller was shocked by such a strange reaction. Kenny also reported that his grandfather, the chairman of the TK Group Corporation, was waiting for him. The director of the production department froze briefly in amazement, then grabbed his head and grinned. Putting on his jacket, Toller Jr. quickly went to the exit, ordering his subordinates to follow him, while wondering why his grandfather could have called him, and at the same time that his new secretary was, after all, an abnormal fool. May resentfully recalled Luke's words about hatred and thought about how she didn't like him from the moment they first met. The arrogant heir to the title of Duke of Stanningham and the most powerful corporation in the country was called a prince by many, although he was and remained the most ordinary bastard. However, in the car, unfairly demoted and then insulted by her new boss, Miss Kenny kept looking at her scowling boss in the rearview mirror and realized that she was admiring. May recalled how the arrogant boss leaned towards her with his cruel words, how he looked over her shoulder, his profile, his lips. The woman was forced to admit to herself that Mr. Luke Toller was completely her type. Surrounded by magnificent gardens and rugged woodland, the majestic sunray which TK Group's new secretary, May Kenny, visited before taking up her duties was a sight to behold. But the owner himself made an even stronger impression on Miss Kenny than the ancestral mansion of the chairman of the concern. Standing alone in front of the Duke of Stanningham sitting at a luxurious desk, May shrank under his predatory, imperious, and moreover, searching gaze. Mr. Sean Toller calmly and arrogantly told the secretary that his grandson, the director of strategic planning, had highly praised her, and then asked whether Miss Kenny really knew her business so well. The head of the conglomerate demanded that May do everything properly, working under the command of his other grandson, to which the secretary of the production department stammered and said that she was still not that good. Sean Toller scared May because he heard that her younger brothers showed promise in speed skating. Calling Miss Kenny his deputy, the oligarch said that if the brothers are like her, they must be amazing, and TK Group is not against supporting talented athletes. May Kenny remembered the words of the director of the concern's strategic planning department, Chester Toller, that she was waiting for a very good offer from Sunray. Shyly under Sean's narrowed tiger gaze, the secretary of the production department realized that this was exactly it. After the meeting, walking through the magnificent garden, the tired young woman recalled the conversation with the Tiger Man, his bestial gaze and demand to do everything as it should, and felt like a victim of a predator. But May convinced herself that everything was fine, and there was no need to be afraid, because up to this point, she had been doing well. Then I thought that I didn't delve into the twins' affairs much, and they probably need money now, and how great it would be if the brothers only had the opportunity to play sports. At that same moment, Miss Kenny heard a call. It was one of her brothers, Martin. Together with Maycard, he was just celebrating receiving official sponsorship from TK Group in his mother's cafe, to the envy of the neighbors. The older sister praised the twins and decided that, for the sake of their happiness, she must somehow please Luke Toller. And now, sitting in the car with him to accompany him to a meeting with the head of the concern, Kenny was tormented by the realization that she really liked the executive director himself as a man. May tried to convince herself not to even think about such a misalliance, and also tried to figure out how to please this angry boss for the sake of her brothers. Thus began Miss May Kenny's work as secretary to TK Group's manufacturing executive, Mr. Luke Toller. With the chairman, Luke behaved like a gentle and courteous grandson. He was interested in his grandfather's health and recalled how he brought him gifts from Austria as a child. The oligarch also looked like a completely different person than when he first met May Kenny, although he did not respond to her appeal. The secretary was surprised at how kind the Duke looked, but thought that his grandson was probably the only one who could talk to him so freely. Finally, the head of the corporation turned his attention to May Kenny and angrily asked if she was doing her job properly. May trembled internally under Sean Toller's gaze and said quietly that she had not shown her best side since this was her first day. The head confirmed that he knew about her lateness, to which Kenny promised to improve. Luke, looking at the secretary, wondered what was wrong with her. Her behavior seemed to have turned 180 degrees. The Duke of Stanningham sternly said that he had high hopes for Miss Kenny, and it would be great if she did not disappoint him. May, trembling, babbled that she was honored and that she would do her best to live up to expectations. The oligarch's grandson was shocked by the unexpected cowardice of his subordinate. Sean again approached Luke, inviting him to come to Sunray more often and reminding him that he was one of the key people in the TK Group. The chairman also recommended the proper use of such a talented employee as Miss May Kenny. Luke Toller agreed that such a talented person was difficult to find, out of habit calling his secretary his deputy. But nevertheless, Luke wanted to complain about the unceremoniousness of May, who burst into his apartment without knocking in the morning. May Kenny didn't want to get fired on the first day, so she decided to tug Toller Jr. by the sleeve to stop his flow of speech. Toller turned around indignantly and then began to continue the story of the past morning. Then May grabbed his hand. Turning around, Luke saw both an angry and pleading look with tears in his eyes. The director wanted to tell the high-ranking grandfather that the secretary was a little crazy, but he had just begun when May Kenny began to cough. The head of the corporation said that, as far as he understood, Luke was pleased. The grandson found no other option but to agree and say thank you very much for his grandfather assigning such a wonderful secretary to him. In the evening, May almost fell on the threshold of the apartment she rented with her friend. She was exhausted from the meeting with the head of the corporation. She just wanted to take a shower and immediately fall asleep. But joyful twins were waiting for her at home. Neighbor and childhood friend Sandra Locke, or simply Sandy with a ladle in her hands, questioned May about whether she had eaten. May was surprised that the brothers appeared at her house so suddenly. Martin, Maycard, and Sandy explained that they had planned a surprise party for the brothers' sponsorship. Sandra sent her friend to the shower and began to eat. The twins rushed to help her, although in fact they interfered. Tired of hard work, May thought that, as she had once heard, idiots cannot be rehabilitated. After taking a contrast shower, the woman felt that she had come to life. Then Sandy looked in and cheerfully told her that her older brother would come soon, and they could have dinner together. May was surprised and delighted. She had not seen Hank, with whom she had been friends throughout her childhood for a long time, and she missed him. The bell rang, followed by a conversation at the door. The Kenny brothers interrogating Hank Locke about how he got there and whether he was stuck in traffic. May was delighted to see her childhood friend mature. A handsome man with fair hair and green eyes who had just arrived greeted her joyfully and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Hank Locke looked at May Kenny with interest, and it was mutual, but they were used to perceiving each other as named relatives. In a brotherly way, the guest ruffled the hair of his childhood friend and said that she was still the same. May was surprised and asked if it was because of the T-shirt with the dog Trusty. Hank confirmed that this was exactly why, and that he did not expect that her friend still liked this character. Siblings Kenny and Locke were very happy to see each other. They all treated each other like one family. They were born and raised in the neighborhood, constantly visited each other. Hank even became a babysitter for little May, almost the same age as his sister and her tiny brothers. May Kenny left school early as the top 17-year-old in the country to get into university, but she failed to make any friends from her year. So the time spent with Hank and Sandra Locke became May's best childhood memories. The older brother and friend prepared the girls for tests, had lunch with them, supported their conversations and jokes, and in childhood, games. She and May Kenny studied at the same school and often walked home together, while they usually met Sandy at the neighboring school, and the three of them could go for a walk. Hank also gave his friend great support when she entered university at a young age, and was reliable, like a big brother. Kenny and Locke clinked glasses during the meeting, most of them with beer, only May with cola. Sandra habitually joked that her friend didn't even know the taste of beer, and that she was missing out on one of the joys of life. May was embarrassed, but did not want to violate the principles of a healthy lifestyle, although she confirmed that the reason was good. The table was filled with congratulations to the twins on their sponsorship and to Hank, a former law firm scout. The man corrected him that he was now a lawyer in the production department of TK Group, which is why he returned to the USA and was going to settle here. May said that from that day on, she also worked in the production department of TK, only as a secretary. A friend began jokingly interviewing her, asking about her impressions of working with Luke Toller. May Kenny replied that she had no words, and Sandra giggled that May had an expression like a smeared turd. In a professional reporter's voice, Miss Locke began to say that Luke Toller, the third-generation Duke of Stanningham, had long been known as the only recognized grandson of the country's largest conglomerate, TK Group. Dubbed since childhood as TK's next successor, with blue blood and a doll-like appearance, Toller Jr. grew up under the close attention of the whole country for his unique, aristocratic personality. The huge interest in the heir of a giant concern led to the invasion of paparazzi and reporters into his private life. So due to pressure from the press, Luke disappeared as an adult, and now only rumors circulate about his beauty. Sandra wondered if May really had nothing to say about working with a third-generation duke, so handsome that photographs of him could be sold. In addition, she considered the position of his secretary to be a rapid promotion. She and May spoke little about work, and the secretary herself sighed that it would be good if she was not fired. Lowering her head, Kenny added that the executive director hated her. The rest of those sitting at the table were shocked by this news. May Kenny explained that she and Luke Toller joined the company at the same time and did not immediately get along in character, which contributed to the emergence of mutual hostility. And now, although Toller Jr. and Kenny hated each other, they were forced to work together. Green-eyed Hank sympathized with the fact that his childhood friend had to work with the enemy under constant stress and asked if she had a hard time during the day. May agreed, but said that she would receive a bonus for her suffering and this kept her in office. The named brother carefully put his hands on her shoulders and said that money is money, but health is more important, and that this is May's problem, that she always tries too hard. Miss Kenny promised to try not to overexert herself, so her friends and family wouldn't worry. She mentally noted that Hank was always very friendly, and that if her new boss was half as nice, she wouldn't suffer so much. But Luke Toller was tough and always angry. As soon as May remembered her boss, orders immediately came from him in the messenger for urgent matters that suddenly arose, although the working day was already over, as well as for tomorrow. The next morning, Mr. Toller, Jr., standing in his pajamas in his apartment, which also served as his home office, scolded his assistant for being 30 minutes late. May Kenny made excuses that she had arrived on time, but the password for the front door had been changed, and from Toller's reaction, it was clear that he had changed the password on purpose. But May had to promise that she would improve. She also said that she would move the schedule to the time of today's delay so that there would be no disruptions in the work. The director, yawning, approved her proposal. Kenny waited for the boss to be ready for the briefing. He said that he had just woken up, but was already tired. The assistant was prepared for this turn of events. She had morning coffee with her especially for Mr. Toller. The director brushed aside that he only drinks coffee made from ground beans grown in the mountains of Kenya, a blend, aromatic, sour, heavy, but light. Luke ordered the available coffee to be poured into the sink, and then, yawning, said that he needed to rest for as long as his schedule had been delayed. Miss Kenny had to object that the director was expecting his cousin, the head of the strategic planning department, Chester Toller. The executive director said that he would not go to the meeting, only that he had gotten up early in vain and demanded that the assistant cancel his schedule. So, on the second day of work as a secretary, and for the first time in 10 years at TK Group, May Kenny's patience reached its limit. She could hardly say that she would send a request first. Sometime later, standing in front of Mr. Toller in the office of the TK Group production department, the secretary reported to the boss about the situation in various companies united by his grandfather into a single concern: electronics, trade, construction, resort business, and Luke's biggest headache, the fashion business. TK Fashion, which was called Toller Textile many decades ago, became the foundation of TK Group Corporation. But due to poor performance, this business has become the biggest headache of the current TK. Luke furiously asked how to improve a decrepit business in such a short time, around which there were rumors of an imminent sale, and why he should be the one doing it. He shouted that while he was working, that bastard Chester took everything that brought in money and left him a headache that he had no desire to take on, and that when the assistant said that he owed it, it was like a slap in the face. Kenny thought that Toller Jr. was a problem, not a person, that he didn't even seem to have any thoughts of working, and she wondered how the executive director was even going to conduct business. I wondered where that enthusiastic Luke Toller from the training center had gone. May considered the period of study at the center to be a series of her failures, but nevertheless, she missed that time, mainly because of Toller, although she was afraid to admit it to herself. Handsome, stately, in an expensive suit, driving a luxury car, and at the same time intelligent and proactive, Luke fully justified the nickname Prince. And now he sat stretched out in the director's chair and did not seem at all eager to work. The secretary glared at the leader with a lustful, but at the same time condemning look, which also showed nostalgia for the old Luke. Noticing this, Toller became embarrassed and angry. He rudely, with obscenities, asked what Kenny was thinking about at the moment. The secretary realized that she had made a mistake by forgetting to keep her face, and Luke mockingly continued that how could it be that Miss Kenny's deputy, the ideal artificial intelligence of TK Group, was standing and glaring at his boss. Kenny said with difficulty that she was embarrassed and that it was a great honor to take care of the executive director, but in her heart she was offended, but also pleased that she continued to be called deputy. Toller rose from his chair and hovered over his assistant, about to say something edifying, but stopped short, staring at the valley of her breasts. Then he came closer and leaned towards May, glancing greedily over her lips, neck and neckline of her blouse. His own lips parted, he said in a choked voice that he and May were the only two here. But then he abruptly continued that this is why Kenny should have at least pretended that she was telling the truth, turned around, and walked away, angrily lecturing May to better hide the fact that she did not like working with him. Miss Kenny coughed, horrified by what she had imagined. The woman thought that the boss might kiss her, and she wanted this kiss. But everything turned out to be nonsense. Burning with shame, the secretary of the production department doubted that she would be okay. TK Group manufacturing executive Luke Toller was dozing in his work chair when he dreamed in detail of his first meeting with the upstart Kenny in the training center in Group A of the 53rd year. Hardworking and impudent, with a lot of successful ideas, May immediately seemed dangerous to Toller, although her figure was okay, but she could dress more interestingly and be less impudent. When Kenny was declared the best in the course, the ambitious grandson of the head of the corporation thought that this time he would lose to the girl who had climbed to the top, but next time he would be the best. The grandfather advised the ambitious intern to take a closer look at the promising girl, but Luke was not going to waste his attention on her. Moreover, this upstart did not seem to pay attention to Toller Jr. and did not appreciate his ideas. Other girls at least appreciated his status and appearance. A tall, broad-shouldered brunette with a toned torso, the grandson of an oligarch and a third-generation duke, Luke never suffered without female attention, although the attention was not always what he wanted. The trainees from the training center looked at him from afar and whispered, giggling embarrassedly, or even running away when Luke noticed their interest and smiled. Toller was unpleasant that many of the girls couldn't even look him in the eyes normally. Their wet glances from around the corner and whispering were boring. One day, standing in an empty hallway at the end of the day with a can of cool cola and feeling revived in this silence, and with a refreshing drink, Luke thought about how tired he was after all of maintaining an image all day. The handsome man's privacy was disturbed by May Kenny passing by with some papers. Her serious, interested gaze was immersed in these papers. Slightly disheveled chocolate hair fluttered in the draft. The uniform blue long sleeve of an intern went to her gray-blue eyes. Passing by Luke Toller, May looked him straight in the eyes, smiling in greeting. Her gaze seemed affectionate. Without saying anything, the girl walked past, and Toller felt his mood immediately sour, which seemed illogical to the young man. Toller looked first at the butt emphasized by light trousers, then at the flowing hair of his future secretary, and thought how impudent and, in fact, callous, a robotic nerd she was. Waking up in the director's chair, the head of the production department was surprised and irritated by his ridiculous dream. Before he had time to finally wake up, May Kenny burst into the office, despite the protests, with a huge stack of documents for approval. The executive director was indignant that he had to first wait for permission before entering. But Luke didn't have time to finish his sentence when the ghost of that old May from the training center seemed to appear before his eyes, and that direct, serious look from behind the huge glasses simply burned through Toller. Miss Kenny explained her behavior by saying that Mr. Toller seemed to have dozed off, and she could not wait any longer. Luke decided that this was fair, although impolite, and reluctantly agreed. This time, the secretary brought a report on the resort business for approval. Luke was first amazed by the number of documents related to such a simple matter, and then by the quality of the report, which was almost too easy to look at. The head of the production department gave Miss Kenny a recommendation to simply do everything in moderation, and sarcastically explained that no matter how hard she tried, nothing of this would remain, and no one would even know. In an arrogant tone, Luke said that TK Group is not a company that will stop working without him. May agreed. She had no intention of prying on Toller, which was impossible because of his family connections, although the secretary would not mind if the director described her work positively to others. To appease Luke, May began to talk about how irreplaceable he was, how everyone on the team knew how hard he worked, and what an honor it was for her to help such an executive director. Toller was puzzled whether this upstart really began to appreciate him, or she was just pretending. Resting his cheek on his palm, the executive director grumbled that the secretary could go and that he would check the report again later. Miss Kenny left, respectfully saying that she was ready for the boss's corrections, who sternly confirmed that corrections could be made. Left alone in the office, Luke Toller became sad. He didn't understand why this impudent woman was either being rude or sucking up, and it was a shame that she didn't seem to care about him. Luke's cousin and main competitor, Director of Strategic Planning Chester Toller, greeted his cousin in his office with a Hollywood smile and an angry look. Chester sarcastically told Luke that he had heard about his reluctance to work and added that management was glad that Toller Jr. was back in charge, to which Luke muttered that May Kenny had done all the work. The older cousin's tone became even more sarcastic, but for some reason his gaze softened. Chester said that, apparently, assigning Deputy Kenny to Luke was a good idea. Toller Jr. displeasedly asked under what pretext the cousin transferred Miss Kenny to the position of secretary. Had he really found her weak point? Then Luke added that it was too much to demote the deputy and at the same time assign him to him like a boa constrictor. Chester laughed that he had been doing some research with the advertising executive the last few days and discovered that Kenny's younger brothers were up-and-coming athletes at the New York City Speed Skating Club. Luke found it strange to sponsor those who had not yet achieved real results. Chester leaned back in his chair and, enjoying his tea, suggested in a malicious and mysterious tone that we call it potential sponsorship. The younger cousin called it despicable how the director of the strategic planning department took advantage of Kenny's deputy's weakness to make her secretary of the production department. Chester grinned that Luke himself wanted to quit his job and go abroad, so there would be someone to replace him. The production manager thought he didn't know much about his assistant, and all Toller Jr. had previously known was that her parents ran the old meat called diner. Now it turns out that she has younger brothers, and they play sports professionally. This is probably burdensome. Luke Toller realized that Miss Kenny couldn't refuse the sudden offer from Sunray, and thought that his cousin was an incredible scoundrel. Chester sarcastically said that, as he thought, the secretary was doing a good job with his boss. The director of strategic planning also noted that after learning more about Miss Kenny, Luke seemed to become worried. The younger cousin was indignant and said that this could not be. Why should he worry about the secretary? But at the same time, he remembered how her fingertips clasped his hand at the meeting with the head. I also remembered the previously unusual pleading look of Kenny's sparkling blue eyes. He objected to himself that this was simple rudeness, that May always behaves like an emotionless machine, but she copes with her responsibilities perfectly, and her manners are just minor inconveniences that can be tolerated. On a warm, sunny afternoon, Luke Toller had free time to relax on a comfortable sofa with a cup of aromatic coffee. But then the loud, decisive steps of the assistant were heard. Luke was furious that this harpy was again not letting him relax for a minute. Miss Kenny stormed in like a hurricane, holding an eternal tablet and asking if the director had had a good lunch, and at the same time frightening her boss with her overly assertive appearance and loud voice. In an energetic, businesslike tone, she announced the start of the afternoon briefing, according to the schedule. The executive director protested, but the secretary seemed not to hear, babbling something that Luke could not understand, since he had not yet switched from rest to work. Then, in the car, the director complained to his driver that he felt like he was filming a thriller every day. I was indignant that May Kenny, like a boa constrictor, cannot leave a person alone for a second with her eternal approve. Please, as soon as silence falls, this vixen bursts in without knocking. Simply the best suspense of the year. Luke said that just from the sound of her footsteps in the distance, his heart begins to flutter, and he goes crazy. He was indignant that he was May's boss, so why should he be afraid of her? To which the driver Kemp politely grinned that this is Miss Kenny. She is always passionate about her work. Toller also smiled tiredly and directed the driver for the third time in the same circle. He did not want to return to the office or appear in public at all. Tormented, with circles under his eyes, Toller complained to Kemp that only here, in the car, could he calmly rest his soul, to which the flattered driver politely replied that he was glad to try. Suddenly the phone rang. It was May Kenny. Luke began to object, but did not have time to finish his sentence before the assistant answered the phone. Then the boss quietly ordered to say that he was not there, but the secretary heard everything. She addressed Toller directly, saying that she knew he had nothing to do outside of his schedule, to which Luke responded in horror that he had a lot to do. The assistant asked if the executive director thought there was something she didn't know about him, and said that there was a mountain of work that had accumulated. She asked if Luke could come back quickly, to which he shouted that he was busy. The assistant agreed that, of course, Mr. Toller was busy, and said that she would wait for him until he returned. Then at home, May cried that the irresponsible director arrived much later than the end of the working day. Sandra was supporting her suffering friend when Hank arrived. May was delighted and asked if he came straight after work. Hank confirmed and said he wanted to come quickly. Sandy noted that her brother arrived just in time. The courier had just brought food from May's parents' restaurant. She really wanted to eat her mother's side dishes. Hank smiled and said that this should not be missed. May wanted to feed her friend properly, but he said that he would just try. May retorted that her mom always sends food with Hank in mind, so let him eat well. Hank expressed his gratitude. After eating, the man noticed bundles and bags and asked May if she was going somewhere. Then he realized that his sister had a date tomorrow. Sandy was shocked by her brother's knowledge and asked how Hank knew where she was going if she didn't tell him. It turned out that the guy with whom the date was scheduled, the son of the director of Hospital J, Hank's classmate from elementary school, they had just called each other 3 days ago via instant messenger. The problem was that May had to go on a date, but neither Hank, nor especially his classmate, who had actually never seen Sandy in person, needed to know about this. The hospital director's son called his supposed counterpart's brother to ask if he had done something wrong because he thought Sandy was speaking harshly to him. But in fact, it was May who was doing housekeeping. In response to his sister's questions about the conversation with his classmate, Hank replied that he called Sandy stylish and pretty and asked to tell him a little about her. And his brother told his classmate that Sandy loved the French restaurant at the M Hotel. May was horrified. She was aware of her problems with communication and wasn't particularly interested in clothes. But now she had to pretend to be pretty and stylish, and she was a little envious that they were talking about her friend like that. Sandy giggled and sent her brother home under the pretext that it was time to go to bed. Hank was surprised, but didn't ask anything, only asked May to tell her mom thank you for the delicious dinner. May was angry at her friend for getting her into this situation and at herself for agreeing to it. Sandy tried to calm her down, promising that everything would go well, but May doubted it. 3 days before dinner with Hank, the friends were just discussing where the date should take place. Sandy persistently suggested a French restaurant at the M Hotel. May complained that it was an ordinary place to eat and the prices were too high, and May was not as much a fan of France as her friend. Sandy convinced May that Hotel M had a good atmosphere. May wondered how this atmosphere could help her meet a guy instead of a friend. But she begged May to help her, because it was on the evening of the date that the final concert of her favorite pop group was to take place before its members were enlisted in the army. Sandy could not miss such an event, especially since tickets were so difficult to get. But her mother insisted on a date with the son of the hospital director and promised that she would not pester her daughter for 6 months. Sandy swore that if May went on a date instead of her, she would do May's cleaning, cooking, and dishes for a year. The friend replied that this was not necessary, but that she would only go if the date lasted no more than an hour. Now, Sandra Locke, a fashion magazine editor with 8 years of experience, had to dress her childhood friend so that her counterpart would not suspect anything, and so that, in principle, she would look decent on a date. May had no interest in fashion, wore the same high-quality but outdated suit for 10 years, and in her free time, she hid her athletic figure behind baggy t-shirts and could easily walk around the city in sweatpants and flip-flops. Now she wondered how she could pretend to be an expert in the field of fashion if she didn't understand anything about it at all. But Sandy promised that she would make May a perfect copy of herself. Even better, he'll make a whole new May Kenny. On the day of the promised meeting with the son of the director of Hospital J, as well as the concert of Sandy's favorite band, she began to prepare her friend for a date. May tried to object, but Sandy reminded her that they had already agreed a long time ago, and now refusal was unacceptable. To the sounds of music flowing from the player, Sandra cheerfully dragged her friend to transform. At the same time, I decided to make a video like beauty bloggers and announced May as my special guest. May was embarrassed, but Sandy convinced her that it was fun and reminded her that she would do her friend's makeup anyway, with or without a video. Starting with skincare products, Sandra showed off an organic emulsion for sensitive skin and a soothing toner with a radiant effect. Sandy praised May's skin, continuing to call her friend her guest, and responded to the test subject's objections that this was some kind of makeup role-playing game. The editor of a fashion magazine and a newly minted beauty blogger was running puffs and brushes over her friend's face, shading something. She, like an artist, painted a new May. When the makeup was finished, Sandra Locke allowed her friend to look at herself in the mirror. Amazed, May looked at the reflection and could not believe that it was her. Sandy announced that May admires early that this is not the end yet, because she still needs to choose an outfit. At this time, the luxurious car of Luke Toller, who was supposed to take part in a meeting of elementary school classmates, drove up to the M Hotel. Driver Kemp helpfully opened the door and wished the boss a fun time. Luke thanked him, but he really didn't want to waste his day off meeting people of little interest to him. On the way to the lounge bar where the meeting was to take place, Luke noticed a sporty, brown-haired woman in a rather short skirt. He did not see the girl's face, and therefore did not understand that it was May Kenny. May stood at the entrance to the restaurant and regretted that she was on time, since she hoped to shorten the date by being late. She did not notice Luke Toller. The restaurant turned out to be quite beautiful. The food was also tasty, although in Kenny's opinion, it was not worth the money that was asked for it. The son of the director of Hospital J, Dr. Chuck Chaucer, turned out to be a short and slightly uptight middle-aged man, proud of his status, but awkward in dealing with women. He announced to May, who he thought was Sandra Locke, that he expected her to be much shorter, but he liked that she was tall and very beautiful. May was flattered. Chuck tried to start a conversation, asking his counterpart if she liked the cuisine. May giggled awkwardly. In fact, she was afraid of food getting into her mouth because she was not used to wearing contact lenses instead of glasses. 50 minutes of the date had already passed. May sadly looked at the time on her phone and reassured herself that she only had 10 minutes left to hold out. The doctor was surprised that pseudo-Sandra's phone holder was some kind of child's one, with a picture of a cartoon dog. But overall, he wanted to continue the meeting and suggested that May go to the lounge bar on the top floor of the hotel. Chuck had heard that the lounge was famous for its New York night cocktail and that it was fantastic to enjoy the night view that its name suggests while drinking a delicious drink. May replied that she would like to visit this bar, but unfortunately she has to work early tomorrow. Entering the toilet, the woman exhaled with relief that the date was over. But now she wanted to get rid of the lenses that were causing her eyes to hurt and the uncomfortable shoes. And in general, May was very uncomfortable in an unusual way. It seemed to her that her hair was getting into her eyes and that various fibers were sticking to her new gray-blue jacket. But it was a pity not to use the voucher Sandy gave for accommodation at the M Hotel, which included breakfast and cocktails, and this voucher was non-refundable. May hesitated because she really had to be at work early the next day, but the dazzling beauty of the hotel and the paid accommodation took over. Miss Kenny decided that she had been so tired over the past months that it was time to rest. At this time, Luke Toller was drinking wine in the lounge bar in the company of former classmates, and they questioned him about whether he had acquired a loved one. Toller was angry at the questions asked, and his childhood friends chuckled when the secretive Luke talked about love at all, and how long he was going to remain single. Luke felt annoyed. He suddenly realized that he was really all alone, but continued to believe that this was none of the business of his interlocutors. His classmates continued to ask, maybe he already had some professor's daughter in mind. Luke said no, and wondered why everyone was so interested in his personal life. The interlocutors laughed, taking it as a funny invention that the 34-year-old third-generation Duke had never had a relationship. One of the classmates jokingly suggested drinking and praying for the eternally lonely Luke Toller. The rest agreed and clinked their glasses. Luke listened to the chuckles about how he would ever get married again, and how others wanted to see him date, and thought that his classmates were somehow having too much fun. Toller took a sip from another glass, and then his gaze fell on graceful legs and elegant shoes. Having admired the legs, the man glanced higher at the vaguely familiar figure, lingered in turn on the thin waist, chest, sharp collarbones, swan neck, and having reached the face, was dumbfounded. May Kenny walked past Luke Toller with her easy gait in a short skirt, a tight jacket, and evening makeup. Listening to the sound of the beauty's footsteps moving away from him, Luke Toller hesitated whether it was really May Kenny or just his imagination. He suspected that he must have gone crazy, because why would his secretary be in the lounge bar now? To check if Mei Lee had just passed him, Luke messaged her to come to his home office at 8 o'clock on Monday. Immediately, an incoming message signal was heard, and the Grace in a gray-blue skirt set took out the phone. Attached to it was the same May pop socket with the stupid dog. Just a few days ago, Mr. Toller was indignant that this holder was too dirty, and it was time to throw it away. The boss barely had time to think that there was probably no one other than May Kenny who could wear such a dirty thing when he received a reply message from the secretary that he would be there at the appointed time. It was obvious to Luke that the answer came as soon as the elegant woman who looked like May touched the phone. Toller stared in confusion at his transformed assistant, which was immediately noticed by one of his former classmates. A childhood friend announced that Luke could not take his eyes off the beauty sitting near the window opposite. Others also noted the young woman's model appearance and giggled that it was love at first sight. Toller was indignant, saying that this was nonsense and that the woman at the window simply looked like his friend. May, out of curiosity, decided to try the cocktail that Chuck Chaucer beautifully told her about, especially since she didn't care about staying at the hotel for the night. The woman planned to drink no more than one cocktail and hoped that the New York night would lift her spirits. She slowly sipped the truly delicious drink, enjoying the live music, the ambience, and admiring her own reflection in the night window. But the relaxed solitude was interrupted by the unexpected approach of Dr. Chaucer, who said that he was just about to have a quick drink alone, but that apparently it was fate to meet the woman whom he considered Sandra. Chaucer noted that Pseudo-Sandy had ordered a cocktail he recommended, and it looked like he wanted to treat her to the others. May felt trapped, unable to drink more than one glass. While waiting for the bar card, Chuck talked incessantly about things of little interest to May, and she did not know how to react. She did not want to expose her friend either by being rude to Chaucer or by admitting that she was not Sandra. Luke Toller watched May and her companion from his sofa as their classmates prepared to leave the lounge bar. The oligarch's grandson noticed that the man sitting next to May was not her boyfriend, and that she was burdened by his company. Chuck ordered more drinks. He heard that Sandy Locke is a cocktail maniac, and when he comes to the bar, drinks 3 glasses at once. Also, the son of the hospital director, embarrassed, admitted that he had read all of Sandra's articles. It seemed that he had already mentally imagined Sandy as his wife. May was sad that she had missed the fact that her childhood friend had a holiday every day, and decided that it would be better to drink everything quickly and still send Chuck, but did not realize that the cocktails would be so strong. While May, with her eyes closed, drank glass after glass and got drunk, Chuck Chaucer told her the history of cocktails, which he taught all night. Pseudo-Sandra was already pretty drunk when her counterpart received a call from his former classmate and brother of the real Sandy, Hank Locke. Chuck cheerfully reported to Hank that he was with his sister, joked that his brother was afraid for his youngest, and displeasedly asked if Hank was really near the hotel and would come now. The doctor muttered that he was going to take Sandra himself, but he had to agree that her older brother would do it. Having arrived in Sandy's place and no longer able to sit straight at the table, a flushed May realized that she needed to leave before Hank arrived, but she was overcome by weakness. And besides, she did not know how to politely end a conversation or politely refuse offers. Chuck apologized for talking on the phone to his counterpart, reminded her that she had one more cocktail left, and recommended drinking it more slowly. The woman was glad that it was the last glass, and made the unwise decision to drink it in one gulp so as not to burn too much, and to end the date quickly. Chuck Chaucer grinned that, apparently the beauty drinks well. While everything swam and spun before May's eyes, Chuck noticed that the woman was feeling bad and offered to help. May replied that it was time for her to go, stood up with difficulty, and almost fell. Chuck said that she just needed to sit quietly and wait for Hank, who would come to pick her up. Miss Kenny barely perceived Chaucer's words. She saw double, and she could not stand on her feet. Chuck had to hug May a little to prevent her from falling. The hospital director's son said that the one he believed to be Sandra Locke had drunk too much and needed to sit and rest, while May tried to go to her room. Chuck Chaucer heard an angry shout. It was Luke Toller who approached, and accustomed to giving orders, in an angry voice in which notes of jealousy were felt, ordered not to paw a person who did not want it. Dr. Chaucer was frightened and hastened to explain that it was just a misunderstanding, but Luke harshly said that he was sitting nearby and saw how Chuck forcibly forced his interlocutor to drink alcohol. Chaucer, with the words that he was not some strange guy and had no defamatory intentions, began to look in his pockets for a business card. For this he had to let go of May, and she fell right on top of her headmaster and giggled stupidly. Toller, without looking away, looked at the secretary's shiny hair, intoxicated blush, wet eyes and lips, and hugged her shoulders, trying to help her straighten up. When May was able to raise her head and straighten her back, leaning on Luke now not with her forehead, but with her juicy breasts, her deep cleavage appeared before the carnivorous gaze of the macho, and she herself raised her eyes and recognized her boss. Luke himself didn't understand why he was scared when the secretary recognized him and called him by his position. It was difficult to look away from May's seductive features, but the young duke's eyes began to swim. Blushing and biting his lips, Luke turned away, pulled off his cloak, and threw it over May's neckline, telling her to cover herself. A woman with a cloak thrown over her front muttered something. Toller sharply asked what she was talking about. She didn't immediately understand what she was talking about, but then she started talking about some materials for the briefing, which were unknown where they had gone. Looking down and trying to free her hands from under her cloak, the flushed and disheveled May muttered apologies. Luke, standing next to her with bulging eyes, thought that she was completely crazy. In an alcoholic delirium, the secretary was looking for the missing payment documents, and Assistant Kemp, holding May by the shoulders, Toller was yelling at Chuck Chaucer for pouring a lot of alcohol into her. The doctor was trying to make excuses. He finally found his business card, handed it to the executive director of TK Group, and explained that they were on a date, and also assured that he had no mean intentions. Reading the business card of the doctor of the University General Hospital J, Toller became confused, and Chaucer angrily declared that it was Luke who had rudely interfered, and demanded to know who he was to interfere so rudely. The oligarch's grandson got angry, but was not going to explain anything. He just shouted that he was a work colleague of Miss May Kenny. Now Chuck Chaucer was confused, and Toller Jr. once again confirmed that he was a colleague of the woman with whom Chuck had a date. May tried to argue that Luke was her immediate supervisor, but she couldn't say anything meaningful. The director's cloak, thrown over her lush bust, slipped and ended up on the floor, again revealing her seductive form. The woman tried, but could not lift it. The boss told her to forget about the cloak and sat down behind it, adding that he was very angry. Luke Toller wanted to scold his subordinate right in the lounge bar, but looking up, he stopped short. May, too, was able to awkwardly squat down, and now her breasts were directly in front of Toller's eyes, and from under her short skirt, in addition to her gorgeous legs, her underwear was visible. Biting her lips and tugging at her hair, the tipsy secretary grabbed the hem of her cloak and muttered that he was here. And then, to the utter horror of Luke Toller, the embarrassment of Chuck Chaucer, and the laughter of the other visitors to the lounge bar, the irreparable happened. Letting go of the cloak and clumsily trying to straighten up, the drunken woman first froze almost erotically in a half-bent position, putting her attractive butt aside, then loudly spoiled the air and sighed with relief. Luke grabbed May by the shoulders, shook her, and then, without ceremony, actually wrapped her back in the cloak, while yelling for May Kenny to come to her senses and that he could see everything. The director, as red as a lobster, was indignant at why his assistant drank so much, while the thought could not get out of his head that there were a lot of idiots in the world who could take advantage of a weak and insane woman. It was impossible to understand what exactly May realized, and whether she realized it. But she began to apologize in slurred language to the leader holding her by the shoulders. At this time, the angry Chuck Chaucer intervened. He really wanted to know who May Kenny was, and what kind of work colleague she was who was either shaking her like a sack or hugging her. Hank, who arrived in time, explained that May was his sister's best friend and roommate. Chuck began to be indignant at why another woman had come on a date instead of Sandra, and Hank, in turn, tried to get an explanation from the doctor about how it happened that May got so drunk. Listening to their bickering, Toller Jr. put his arm around the dozing Kenny's shoulders, her head leaning on his athletic chest. Luke was trying to figure out who this Hank was, and why on earth he was standing up for May like that. After Chaucer left, Hank Locke approached the CEO, apologized for what had happened, and introduced himself, explaining that he was the new legal consultant for TK Group's production. Toller peered at the new employee of the corporation, trying to understand what kind of person he was and what kind of relationship he had with his assistant. Wrapped in the boss's cloak, May mumbled incoherently and tried to look at the person who had approached. Her eyes swam and doubled. The woman recognized the named brother rather by his voice, was afraid why he was here, then began to remember that Hank was supposed to come, and that she herself wanted to run away before his arrival, but was already too drunk. Kenny realized that since Sandy's brother saw that she sent her friend on a date instead of herself, the fashion magazine editor is now in a difficult position. In desperation, she slammed her forehead against the shocked executive director's back and grabbed his arm. Luke was surprised and nervous. As he was then at the meeting with his grandfather, he involuntarily bit his lips, and his face was covered with a blush. Hank apologized for his drunken girlfriend and promised to take care of her, which caused Luke's indignation. Pushing May behind his back and bowing his head like a bull, the Duke announced that this woman was his subordinate, and he could not trust her to someone he did not know, and also demanded that Hank explain his relationship with May. The question was unpleasant for the newly minted lawyer of TK Group, since he had long tried to suppress his attraction to his childhood friend. But Hank pulled himself together and said with a wide smile that he and May had known each other since childhood and treated each other like brother and sister. The named older brother hugged May, promised that he wouldn't say anything to Sandy and that everything would be fine, scolded his friend, who had a hard time with alcohol, and asked how much she drank. May replied that it was 3 glasses in a row and some more champagne. She forgot about her first cocktail. With a defenseless look, the woman asked if her brother would scold her. The director standing next to her was surprised that the assistant could make such a facial expression. Hank apologized to the young Duke and promised to introduce himself formally next time, and he also wanted to return his cloak to the boss. Luke refused and personally buttoned the cloak on the defenseless-looking subordinate, telling her to give it back tomorrow. Resentment and jealousy flashed in the gaze of his childhood friend, but he was able to thank Toller for his care. Having hugged the named sister, Hank Locke promised to take her home, which alarmed and outraged the boss. May, in a slurred voice, stated that she couldn't go home, that today she was sleeping at the hotel to improve her mood, and tried to remember the right floor. Hank agreed that he would take her to the room. Indignant, Luke roughly grabbed his subordinate by the arm and sharply asked why on earth he would take May into the room if she was not his girlfriend. Hank was taken aback at first, then grinned and asked if it was okay to take his secretary to the room. Holding back an ironic smile, the lawyer explained that he and May did not have such a relationship, and holding her by the shoulders, led her to the elevator. Waking up in his stylish steel apartment with high ceilings and an eccentric designer chandelier, young millionaire Luke Toller, the third-generation Duke of Stanningham, recalled the events of the previous evening. Rubbing his sleepy eyes and squinting from the sunlight pouring from the window, the grandson of the most influential tycoon in the country could not understand whether he had dreamed of yesterday's goddess of beauty, or if it was reality. For reality, she behaved too stupidly, and at the same time was too touching and defenseless, a guest from a parallel reality, but with a long, familiar face. Luke realized that yesterday he had met the unusually dressed and drunk deputy Miss May Kenny, or rather, for several days now, she had been his secretary and personal boa constrictor. In the lounge bar, she looked mostly very nice. Or maybe he thought so because he had a few drinks himself. But her legs are good. She needs to show them more often. But she needs to drink less, especially in the company of strange men. Standing in the bathroom in only a towel, the athletic, handsome man washed his face with cold water to come to his senses a little. Out of his head was the guy who introduced himself as a childhood friend, and almost Kenny's brother, but looked at her far from like a brother and grabbed her with his vile hands. Luke remembered that he called himself a new lawyer in the production department and decided to see what kind of lawyer he was, and at the same time thought that it was time to update the lists of employees and personally get to know the new guys. Toller was annoyed by how this impudent, supposedly childhood friend hugged Kenny and also took her to the hotel room. What could he do with her there? Or they had been sleeping with each other for a long time. But why then did May call him brother? Also, this mocking look with which Hank Locke asked his boss whether it would be normal to take his secretary into the room. Luke thought angrily that, by the way, he was responsible for his subordinates, so making sure that the secretary was alive and well in her room would be just normal. Although, on the other hand, who is she to worry about her so much? If Kenny's spree interferes with his work, then he can fire her, and the rest is none of his business. Having gotten dressed and examining himself in the mirror, the stately brunette in a well-tailored, expensive suit and an elite watch thought that the secretary's relationship with a lawyer was not something he needed to worry about. At 10 minutes to 8, the director of the production department was getting into his car, at which time May Kenny approached him. Toller had completely forgotten that he had ordered her to come to his home office in the morning. The secretary greeted the boss, as usual, politely and reservedly, and did not seem to remember anything from yesterday's events. Luke was annoyed and upset that May acted as if nothing had happened, and as if the morning had really been good for her. Besides, she looked well-rested and not hungover. Toller thought indignantly that he didn't even want to look at the shameless face of his assistant, and didn't want to hear her impudent voice either, and also that May Kenny got on his nerves too often. At the beginning of the lunch break, the secretary politely knocked on the door of the director's office. Without waiting for an answer, she entered, trying not to betray fear and shame. The manager was sitting on the edge of the office table and thoughtfully looking out the window. His face was angry and sad. Trying to appear cheerful, Kenny reported that Mr. Toller's lunch was ready. The director looked at his subordinate suspiciously, paused, and then replied that he still had no appetite. Luke also ordered the entire schedule for today to be canceled due to his poor health, to which May replied that she would fulfill everything. Coming out of the boss's office, Miss Kenny squatted down by the door and buried her forehead in a folder with documents. She was feeling hot, and her heart was pounding. May never returned the cloak, but she was scared to even think about somehow starting a conversation about the events of the past evening, although in her mind the secretary scolded herself for yesterday's behavior and called herself crazy. Blushing with shame, Miss Kenny debated whether to pretend she didn't remember or apologize. From the expression on Luke Toller's face and tone of voice, it looked like he didn't even want to see his assistant, and she was afraid to catch the manager's eye. The director of the production department of TK Group did not immediately leave the office after the end of the working day. Getting into the car, he ordered the driver to just drive first. In the car, the young Duke leaned his forehead against the tinted side window. He was angry and depressed that the assistant showed no shame in front of him, did not even think to apologize, and did not return the cloak. It seemed like Kenny didn't remember anything from the previous evening, including Luke and his attempts to defend her honor, and forgot about the cloak, whose it was, and left it at the hotel. But she probably spent an interesting night with the lawyer. Deputy Kemp offered to take Mr. Toller to the riverbank and suggested that it would help him to go to an open place and get some air. Luke wondered if he really looked that bad. The driver said that he noticed that Mr. Toller called him when he wanted to be alone, and that he had come up with a place where the executive director could feel better. Luke was puzzled. He did not expect that the driver Kemp was so quick-witted. Toller felt uneasy that the assistant could know more than he should and decide something behind the manager's back. John Kemp exclaimed in surprise that Miss May Kenny was running along the riverbank, and added that there was probably nothing better than running along the riverbank with your head empty. Luke did not at all expect that his secretary, it turns out, also plays sports. Kemp confirmed that sport is Miss Kenny's hobby and that she runs about 10 kilometers at a time. Toller Jr. even respected his employee for playing sports, despite such a busy schedule. At the same time, Luke finally understood how such a boring and old-fashioned woman, even judging by the pop socket, was dirty with childish interests, got such an interesting figure. May Kenny confirmed with all her appearance that she loved sports. The leggings tightly hugged her strong thighs and tight buttocks. The top under her open sports windbreaker exposed her seductive abs. Toller was angry with May and with himself. It was not enough to be carried away by this boa constrictor, moreover, a shameless, impudent person of low origin. Luke took out his irritation on the driver, shouting that, honestly, it was noisy. And could he drive in silence? Kemp apologized, but it didn't look like he really felt the least bit uncomfortable. Toller Jr. arrived at his grandfather's family mansion when it was almost dark, and the sunset painted everything around in crimson tones. There was a bright light burning in the windows of the mansion, and the lanterns in the garden were shining just as brightly. A light family dinner was served in the luxurious sand-colored living room on the ground floor, with Luke, Chester, and Luke's younger sister Susan sitting on an elite upholstered set at a low table. Ironically, but affectionately, looking at her brother, the sister wondered what happened, that he deigned to take part in the dinner. Before, he always came up with excuses for his absence. Luke said with offense that Susan spoke as if he was the only one who was missing somewhere, and asked his cousin why he also came to Sunray. Chester said with a grin that he was engaged to his girlfriend Ursula, and at the same time wanted to see his grandfather not only for family reasons, but also to discuss corporate affairs. Susan expressed her joy at her cousin's engagement and praised him, saying that he was cool. Luke chuckled that his sister said that as if Chester had done something great. In response, Susan jokingly quoted the tabloid press as saying that Chester Toller was choosing relationships over corporations, and began praising her cousin, saying what an incredible romantic he was. Chester was flattered and embarrassed, and Luke said irritably that it was as if his sister had seen love for the first time in a century. Susan began to make fun of her brother, who had only worked all his life and had never fallen in love, saying that her soul was burning with grief. Luke asked his little sister if she came to annoy people with stupid jokes, to which she laughed, which made her brother worry. Luke Toller could not bear it and went outside to get some fresh air. Susan was clearly surprised by this reaction. Chester also looked at his cousin studyingly. Looking displeased at his cousin over his shoulder, Luke invited him to go out for a while. Chester responded with an ironic and somehow victorious look, after which he agreed. Night had already fallen in Sunray. Huge stars were shining in the sky. Windows and lanterns on the ground brightly illuminated stone-lined ponds with clear water and delicious lotuses, well-groomed paths, trees and bushes. Luke stood on the neatly trimmed lawn, looking into the distance. His cousin approached him with a bottle of cold mineral water, which he opened with the words that the weather was a little hot. Luke was surprised. It seemed to him that it was quite cool, and Chester brought the water to his lips and, to his cousin's even greater amazement, began to drink it, just like in the advertisement. Luke was perplexed whether Chester had anything better to do, and at the same time he was terribly envious of how this handsome man looked, even taller and more athletic than himself, while drinking mineral water. Luke's cousin lifted the bottle, half empty, to his forehead, as if he were posing for a magazine, and it suited him very well. Luke thought with hatred as soon as the nasty guy didn't get a sore throat. Chester suddenly announced that it was his cousin who told him that if you drink the way he does now, women find it sexy. Luke angrily thought that Susan was crazy, and Chester wondered what business the executive director of the production department had called him for. Luke replied that there was one case involving May Kenny, and out of habit, he named the woman as deputy. After a pause and gathering his courage, Luke Toller asked his cousin to take her back to his department. When asked by his cousin to take the assistant forced on him back to the strategic planning department, the head of the department refused. Luke shouted that he did not understand why his cousin immediately refused him without even knowing the reason. Chester replied that there were already enough smart people in his department, and May Kenny was working hard next to Luke, and there seemed to be no compelling reason for her to return to the strategic planning department. Lowering his eyes to hide the welling tears, Luke Toller replied that, as his cousin knew, Miss Kenny was too good to be just his secretary. Chester looked triumphant and a little mockingly, and said that Luke himself understood this perfectly well, but still left her around. Narrowing his eyes at his near-crying cousin, the director of strategic planning suggested that perhaps there was some other problem with Kenny. A day after the conversation with his cousin, early in the morning, the executive director of the production department of TK Group heard through his sleep his sister's loud demands to open the door immediately. Bursting like a hurricane into her half-asleep brother's apartment and choking with laughter, flushed Susan brought a smartphone with open gossip columns right to his nose. It said that the paternal grandson of the chairman of the TK Group, influential tycoon Sean Toller, was seen in the lounge bar of the M Hotel with a mysterious non-celebrity woman. Attached were photographs of Luke fastening his assistant's coat and supporting her by the shoulders. The eyes of the mentioned grandson widened. He muttered in shock what this even was, and the sister had fun, quoting the article in different ways. Slyly narrowing her eyes, Susan recited by heart how TK Group Executive Director Luke Toller, whose personal life remained in the shadows, attracted public attention, and the like. Hovering over her older brother, who had fallen into a chair, the woman with a sly smile told him to tell him who his counterpart was. Angry and frightened, Luke mumbled. His sister giggled and said that she would guess now. With a mysterious expression on her face, Susan slowly said that her brother had met with former deputy from the Strategic Planning Department, May Kenny, at the lounge bar. Horrified, Toller asked his sister how she understood this. Susan laughed and said that it was clear from the photographs. She also ironically stated that not even 100 years had passed before she happened to see her brother hugging a girl, to which Luke made excuses about what kind of hugs. The sister continued that usually even the slightest contact with a person terrifies the executive director, but here she couldn't even find the words. After a pause, Miss Toller exclaimed that this was the beginning of an office romance. Luke angrily snapped that what kind of novel, and that his sister was repeating fiction. Susan was indignant that she saw everything correctly from the photo, and that her brother should have romance, love, and all that. The younger sister attacked with a question whether Luke even had thoughts of dating someone. His brother asked him to stop saying such things. She sarcastically said that since her brother said this, perhaps he was already planning a wedding with this woman. Susan then ridiculed her brother, saying that perhaps, in order to be recognized as TK's true successor, he planned an arranged marriage with a girl from an even more powerful family than the Tollers. Making a menacing voice, Miss Toller joked that Luke had lived his whole life for this, preserving his innocence, and that, as they say, harmony for the families of those getting married. The brother, in a panic, rejected his malicious younger sister, saying that he didn't even have any idea of an arranged marriage, and that he wouldn't date just anyone either. The sister chuckled, and a sad and blushing Luke muttered that he would only date a girl if it was love at first sight. Susan at first tried to restrain herself, covering her mouth with her fist, but then she laughed loudly. Luke covered his ears. Miss Toller mocked, saying that here he was, the most innocent man of the century. She showed him respect. The brother was indignant at Susan's reaction. Then his sister grabbed his credit card, which also caused him to loudly protest. But Susan laughed, saying that she supported the beginning of Luke Toller's novel, and that, as always, thanks for the money. Luke was dejected. He stood covering his face with his palm and trying not to cry. That afternoon in May's office, Kenny stood shamefacedly at the CEO's desk and begged forgiveness for causing great harm to his privacy. Luke was just immersed in a newspaper article on business topics and did not immediately realize what the secretary wanted from him. Looking up from the business newspaper, Mr. Toller said that the article about the lounge bar had already been published, and that May had no need to apologize. He himself was also wrong to intrude into her personal life. Kenny said that he didn't need to say that, and that she promised never to let something like that happen again, and at the same time said that she was to blame for not stopping the publication of an article full of lies and distortions. Determined and a little hysterical, the secretary promised that she would make every effort to correct the situation so that the executive director's reputation would not suffer any further. Then she began to apologize again, saying that she was ashamed to even look the director in the eyes. Luke Toller said that everything was fine. It sounded half like an assurance, half like a question. After demanding that the apology be completed, Mr. Toller checked with May about his schedule. It was time to leave for the off-site meeting. Kenny said that she would inform the driver. In the elevator, May was glad that she was able to at least make amends for the situation, and Luke thought that she had gone too far with her obsessive apologies. He also mentally accepted that Miss Kenny would indeed have to deal with the situation. But, Toller Jr. reflected, May Kenny was doing a great job as a secretary. The executive director was trying to figure out what he wanted more, kick May out or leave her. But besides this dilemma, he also wanted to undress her. As they exited the office building, the executive director of the production department and the secretary accompanying him were surrounded by reporters with cameras. Their screams made Toller's ears buzz. They themselves merged into a single fuzzy crowd. It was difficult to understand where one person ended and another began. Luke seemed to himself to be a lonely creature, standing helplessly in front of a hissing, multi-headed hydra. Toller's eyes turned gray. Nausea rose in his throat. He turned white, became covered in drops of sweat, and began to fall. May, screaming in horror, tried to hold on to the boss. The CEO's face felt like plaster. He was trembling. His breathing was too fast. May guessed that these might be symptoms of a panic attack. She thought angrily that this was not surprising because of all the crowd that had come. Toller's personal car, with Assistant Kemp at the wheel, quickly took off around the bend. The reporters standing on the roadway barely had time to dodge. The driver was worried about the boss's condition and was angry at the crowd of people with cameras. He briefly and abruptly invited the boss and his secretary to get into the car. Under the camera flashes, the car pulled away sharply and rushed down the road. Both subordinates feared what would happen to their boss and felt sorry for him because of the sharp deterioration in their health. May tried to stir up Toller. Luke raised his head, grabbed his heart with one hand and the front seat with the other. Tears flowed from his eyes. He heard the secretary say something, but did not understand what. The executive director was breathing with his mouth wide open, heavily, frequently, and noisily, all the time getting confused. Miss Kenny herself had tears in her eyes and sweat on her face. She was afraid that Mr. Toller would die right in the car in her arms. The director could no longer stay seated and fell on the assistant. His face looked like a piece of chalk. His eyes were closed. His lips lost color. Large drops of tears and sweat rolled down Luke's face and neck. He was still breathing heavily and shakily. May hugged his neck with her arms and could barely restrain her own sobs. In oblivion, Toller dreamed of his childhood, his father's wide, predatory smile, his words that Luke is the center of the TK group, and people all over the world are watching him. Little Toller took these words very seriously. He firmly decided not to let his father down and to be worthy of his position, although it seemed to the child that all these incomprehensible and terrible people of the world had fallen on his small shoulders, and at the same time the entire huge grandfather's concern. One day in early spring, at the age of 6, walking, as usual, hand in hand with his mother, the boy for the first time really noticed the cameras pointed in their direction. The baby's eyes widened in horror. So this is what they are. People of the world who are watching him and want to tell him everywhere about his every mistake. The faces of the reporters, their huge cameras, figures, and clothes merged into one motley, noisy spot flashing with blinding lights. Newspapers noticed every step of the heir to the corporation, praised his successes and appearance, called him a prince and perfection, but were also ready to publish any misstep. Young Toller's father's words constantly sounded in his head that he should always behave with dignity, that Luke had no right to be nervous, and must remember that he was the face and future of TK Group. The heir was already a young man when he showed weakness during the next official photo shoot of the Toller family, Dukes of Stanningham. The photographer reminded him of his smile in a businesslike manner, slowly and clearly counted to 3. A bright flash, like the flash of a supernova, blinded the younger Duke, and his ears began to buzz. Then Luke was told that he suddenly fell to the floor, pale and sweating, barely breathing, could not move normally, and did not respond to the cries of his relatives. This time, when he woke up in the hospital, Toller Jr. could not immediately remember how he got there. Luke barely remembered falling, but he realized that he was losing consciousness again. It upset him that every time he hoped that now everything would be okay, but he still fell somewhere. Vague memories came to Toller's head of how he was driving in a car with his secretary, how she tried to hold him, and how she herself was horrified. Slowly, with a weak gait, carrying the IV, Luke left the room and saw Miss Kenny, who had fallen asleep, sitting on the sofa in the hall. Kenny was without a jacket. Her regular face looked calm and gentle in her sleep. Her light blouse revealed her collarbones and emphasized her breasts. Her skirt rose a little, showing her legs. Luke looked at his watch. It was already 1:45 in the morning. The director was pleased, and at the same time embarrassed that his assistant was still next to him, although the working day was long over. The man suggested that Miss Kenny was probably very tired, and he also noticed that her huge old-fashioned glasses, without which she felt much better, had fallen off the secretary. May seemed to have heard footsteps in her sleep, or otherwise felt Toller's presence, because she suddenly opened her huge blue-gray eyes. At first, their gaze was gentle and surprised, but very quickly became stern and indignant. May stood up decisively, walked over to Luke Toller and put her hand on his shoulder. In a concerned but stern tone, Miss Kenny told the boss that it was too early for him to get up. Luke weakly tried to argue that everything was fine, but May led him to the bed and helped him carry the IV. Sitting on his hospital bed, Luke Toller thanked his assistant and said that she could go and that she was probably tired. May replied that she stayed voluntarily. She said that she was responsible for the chief executive and added that she could not predict his condition in advance. Putting on her creepy glasses, May noted that Mr. Toller had been skipping meals a lot lately and said she would leave after she was satisfied that the chief executive had eaten. Luke was indignant that he was not some kind of child, but the assistant asked him to wait a little and soon brought a tray laden with various dishes. May said that the director might not like it, but he should eat everything, to which Luke Toller just sighed angrily. May also added that the boss did not need to worry about today's work matters. She took care of everything herself. At this moment, the secretary simply personified reliability. Toller thanked him in surprise and thought for a moment, standing still with a fork in his hand. He looked at Kenny, disheveled from sleeping in an inappropriate place, who, with her head and shoulders slightly tilted towards Luke, seemed like a mother hen, and it seemed that she clearly would not calm down until he ate. Luke felt funny. He himself was embarrassed by his reaction and coughed. Then he demanded that the dumbfounded May immediately take food for herself, otherwise he wouldn't eat either. Over the meal, Toller admitted to his secretary that he thought she looked like a robot, but now he sees that she has the features of an ordinary person. In particular, her hair is disheveled, and she eats May like everyone else. Kenny was embarrassed and quickly promised to fix it. Luke replied that that was not what he meant. Toller wanted to talk about himself. He admitted that he fainted for the first time when he had just turned 20 years old. The man said that from early childhood, his father was a little strict towards him, demanding that the heir to a huge corporation and a noble title always be perfect. In particular, he did not dare to show a sloppy appearance. May did not expect to hear that the boss always watches himself and is careful in his actions because the paparazzi are watching him to write another report. Luke said that he lives every day, worrying not to harm his grandfather's concern with his behavior and words. Reporters were always watching him, trying to catch him when he made a mistake. so he thought he was ready for sudden camera flashes. But that day, while shooting a family portrait, when there was a flash, he immediately fell. Toller waved his hand and smiled, inviting May Kenny to live a more relaxed life for both of them. But the smile did not seem natural because of the sad eyes. The secretary did not understand what the director meant, either that she was also too tense all the time, or that she was generally suggesting to reduce the distance in the relationship. But how could this be? She was just a subordinate. Kenny thought that Toller was probably just joking about her, and Toller said that there was a lot of talking while eating, and that it was time to just eat. May thought about the boss's story. It was a surprise to her that Toller Jr. was a man who had much more problems than the secretary thought. It was already 3 o'clock in the morning when May got ready to go home, reporting that she would prepare a video meeting the next morning. Luke was surprised because the workday was supposed to start in 5 hours. At 8 in the morning, he joked about whether Miss Kenny got ready for work too early. The assistant explained that since they had already rescheduled once yesterday, it was difficult to adjust the time even more. May assured that she had prepared all the materials in advance so that the boss did not need to worry, and was about to leave when Luke called out to her to wait. The boss said that there wasn't much time left before going to work and offered to stay the night in his room. Toller didn't just undress, but practically stared at the secretary, who blinked her eyes in shock. As soon as he said out loud the invitation to the secretary to stay the night, Luke Toller was horrified by himself and began to mentally call himself crazy. The executive director was amazed at what kind of nonsense came into his head. May pretended that she didn't hear Toller's proposal and asked if he wanted to say something. Luke waved him off that he didn't want to say anything and that it was time for Kenny to go. Left alone in the room, Luke Toller first sat with his mouth half open and his eyes bulging, nervously clutching the sheet with his fingers. Then he grabbed his head and grabbed his own hair, not understanding what was wrong with him. Had he really hit his head when he fainted? After sleeping for several hours, Luke Toller woke up almost when his secretary arrived. Approaching the high window, the executive director stretched and yawned, thinking that he had slept well, but woke up tired anyway. There was a knock on the door. May Kenny came in and said hello, either making a slip or wanting to make a compliment. She called Toller a brilliant director. Luke was unable and in the wrong clothes to connect to a video conference on work issues himself, so he seated his secretary in his place. May monitored compliance with the agenda, passed the floor from speaker to speaker, and also listened carefully to the speakers and wrote down what needed to be conveyed to the boss, although he himself heard. Toller thought Miss Kenny must be tired, but he doesn't even show it as usual. Luke scolded himself for the fact that he was, on the contrary, not like himself, and that recently he had been too emotional and said a lot of stupid things, probably because of how he was feeling. May reported that everything on the morning schedule went well, and she left the future schedule empty due to the director's condition. Luke thanked absent-mindedly. The executive director's younger sister entered the room, stylishly dressed as always, and carrying a luxurious bouquet of flowers for her brother. Luke was indignant at what Susan was doing here, and she handed him flowers and said that she came as soon as she found out that her brother was in the hospital, and then added that, in fact, her mother told her to come. Toller Jr. was horrified that his mother knew about his fainting. His sister said that his mother went to a neighboring town to order a special tonic drink for her son from a popular homeopath. Clutching his thrown-back head, Luke was indignant that he would not drink this nasty thing. Susan giggled. The secretary mentally assumed that her manager must have a good relationship with his family to be so cared for. Susan Toller turned her attention to May and asked if she was May Kenny's deputy. The secretary politely confirmed her name and clarified her position. Continuing to call May the deputy, the executive director's sister said that she had seen her before. When she won first place in the company's employee sports competition, May became embarrassed. Luke angrily told Susan to finish her business, not to say anything stupid, and to leave quickly. The sister said that she had not yet started her business, and grabbing her brother's hand, dragged him along with her. Luke was indignant at what kind of nonsense she had come up with again. Susan, with the air of a conspirator, whispered to her brother that she was helping him. He was indignant that she was crazy. Her sister asked if she should tell her everything. Luke was surprised what Susan was even talking about. She winked slyly at her older brother, approached his subordinate, hugged her hand, and offered to go get coffee together while the patient remained in the ward. May was flattered. Walking down the street with her brother's assistant and sipping coffee, Susan Toller asked if May was very surprised. The secretary took this as a question about the manager's health and sadly said that she did not think that Mr. Toller would faint like that, but added that his condition had already improved noticeably. The interlocutor said thoughtfully that there was nothing strange about fainting, but that she had never seen her brother feel so calm in his life. Miss Toller told a surprised Miss Kenny that their father wanted Luke to be seen as the ideal successor from an early age. She admitted that TK Group Deputy Chairman Stanley Toller was a very greedy person, but he had no other abilities other than greed, so the head of the concern threw him out of his sight. Therefore, Staley Toller wanted to strengthen his position in the company through Sean's eldest recognized grandson at that time, namely through his son Luke. The executive director's sister said her brother really wanted to live up to his father's expectations, and he, in turn, tried to gain his grandfather's approval to the point of sometimes becoming cruel. And so, when Luke was 20 years old, this bastard Chester suddenly appeared and abruptly pushed the previous successor from his position. Susan asked May if she should tell her more about the current main heir to the company, or if she already knew from Miss Toller's intonations. It seemed that she had accepted her cousin, but was suffering because of his conflict with her brother. Secretary Kenny replied that she was aware of Chester's rapid rise in general terms, as it was a widely discussed topic at the time. The interlocutor said that her aunt, Sean Toller's youngest daughter Scarlett, fell in love with a little-known volleyball player Jamie Kenny and went with him to Canada. Scarlett Kenny lived there in hiding for 20 years, and along with the news of her death, the secret of her son's existence was revealed. Sean Toller took in a new grandson who had nowhere to go and passed on his last name to him. For Luke, who was accustomed to believing that he was the only successor to the TK Group, this was a disaster. So as not to be inferior to Chester, he devoted himself entirely to the fight. But Sean had recently handed over more than half of the corporation to Chester, and, as Susan suggested, Luke had decided that his whole life was in turmoil. The secretary thought about it. She was used to thinking that her leader was just a selfish prince, but now she decided that she had rushed to conclusions. Miss Toller continued that as soon as her brother decided to rest, he was immediately put to work, which added additional stress to him. Kenny muttered that she was very sorry. Taking May by the arm and calling her deputy, Susan Toller said that she could not imagine what a joy it was to see her next to Luke, and asked permission to call her sister. May was touched, and at the same time remembered her younger brothers. Susan, hugging her, began to cry. Miss Toller said that she was very sorry for Luke, and he doesn't even know how to rest. It's his first day off in a long time, and he works, even while in the hospital. It's so dear to him. With tears, Susan asked what to do so that her brother could rest in peace. Weak to other people's tears, May Kenny promised to find a way. Miss Toller again called her sister and said that she was the best. Driving along with Susan and Luke Toller and May Kenny, dressed casually, John Kemp explained that he was an expert on games. The boss was indignant. Is this really why he suddenly took them out of town? Kemp cheerfully reported that this was exactly the case. The executive director's sister, smiling slyly, thought that the driver was doing everything right. Secretary Kenny gave the examples of Newton and Descartes, and said that proper rest increases productivity, which helps with career achievement, and that she will do everything possible to ensure that the director gets quality rest. Mr. Toller, wearing a biker jacket over his t-shirt, muttered that it would be so, but that actually he just needed to sleep for a few days, and the trip was annoying and making him laugh. Looking at the boss with interest, Kenny noted that although he said so, he looked worried. May suggested that she had been putting too much pressure on Toller all this time. Luke just chuckled. The assistant promised that they would have a really fun weekend. Luke automatically thought about a very specific type of fun. Luke Toller's driver, John Kemp, was the entertainment leader throughout his junior, middle, and high school years. He was involved both in the organization and as a presenter. John was also simply an active participant in events, including various trips. As a youth, Kemp organized events as a member of the Automotive Engineering Department's Student Council and was also chairman of the Automotive Club. He also really liked gathering informal get-togethers, throwing parties and picnics. After finding out all this, the sister of his boss, the executive director of the production department of the TK Group Corporation, enlisted John Kemp to organize an out-of-town trip, noting that she appreciated his hard work throughout. The driver booked accommodations and made a schedule. The director's secretary, May Kenny, thanked him for his hard work. The boss himself grumbled and resented how far Kemp would take them. The manager's sister dreamed out loud that it would be great if there were no people at all in their vacation spot. But she thought to herself that she was looking forward to the vacation. Arriving at the elite guest house, which received many rave reviews, the guests checked into the most popular two-story rooms with a gorgeous view from the panoramic windows. A total of 2 rooms were rented, by gender, so Susan Toller shared a room with her brother's secretary, and director Luke Toller shared a room with his driver. The Tollers, some with sincere, some with feigned surprise, asked whether there were really only 2 rooms. Assistant Kemp assured them that there would be very room for 4 people here. Susan Toller suggested unpacking first, which everyone did. The other day, Luke Toller, who was discharged from the hospital, did not want to share a room with anyone at all, much less with a subordinate. Luke, in principle, could not sleep when there was someone else nearby, looking at how the driver was sorting out his carefully packed things. Toller thought that Kemp had apparently been getting ready all night. In the women's room, unpacking suitcases was more fun, joking and smiling. The director's sister quietly but carefully studied the assistant and her luggage. Susan was surprised that May had few clothes, and they were all in a sporty style. Kenny explained that she liked simple clothes, preferring comfortable things. Miss Toller objected that they had come on a long-awaited vacation, and they needed to create the right atmosphere. Mr. Toller and Mr. Kemp went into the women's unlocked room while they were still working on their suitcases on the second floor. The driver shouted familiarly if the ladies had finished unpacking their things, and they replied that they would be down soon. A few minutes later, the women came down. Susan was wearing a half-unbuttoned white shirt dress, revealing a straight skirt and black bra, all complemented by a fanny pack and flirty jewelry. May felt awkward in someone else's extra mini-length dress, but the delicate pinkish lilac color suited her extremely well, and there were no repulsive glasses on her face. Luke couldn't take his eyes off the secretary, and he couldn't find anything better than to attack his sister with a question why they were dressed up like that. Susan cheerfully answered that in order to create a vacation atmosphere. Standing behind Miss Kenny, whom the driver Kemp invited to come into the car, Miss Toller whispered to her brother that she did not expect that Sister May's body was so crazy. Luke was angry and demanded to stop saying strange things. The weather was very warm, but the sky was overcast with bluish clouds, and a breeze touched the treetops. Susan said they didn't have much time and suggested they split up into pairs. She wanted to go with the driver to the store and suggested that Luke and May look around and find a place where everyone could have fun. Toller and Kenny looked at the car in which Susan had driven away in surprise. May suggested that since there was nothing else to do anyway, we should really go and look around together. Around the boarding house, there was a deciduous forest with tree-covered hills and well-groomed wide paths. Kenny asked Toller if he liked such paths in the forest. Luke didn't know what to answer, since he hadn't really walked along them before. May told her companion that there were mountains near the house where she lived as a child, which served as a playground for her and her brothers and friends. They went there to look at flowers, collect insects, and have water games. And now when May smells the forest, it takes her back to memories. Luke Toller was more interested in the figure of the assistant than in the forest or mountains, but he kindly noted that Miss Kenny had a good memory. May drew Toller's attention to the ripened dogwood fruits. Going up to the bush, she picked a berry and put it in her mouth. Luke was afraid whether it was edible at all. The woman said that the dogwood was sweet and tasty, and suggested that the executive director try it. She herself put one berry in Luke's mouth, touching his lips with her finger, and looked questioningly at Toller. However, Luke didn't like the taste of dogwood at all. He wrinkled his face and was indignant that it was sour and bitter to him. May said that it seemed like the berry was not quite ripe and offered it to a friend, but Luke refused. The companions continued their walk along the bank of a shallow forest river with amazingly clear water, through which every stone at the bottom was clearly visible. Toller and Kenny threw small, flat stones into the river. Luke talked about different types of birds and plants. On the other side of the river, there was an amazing flower meadow, and Toller suggested going there, which they both did. When May looked around the clearing in admiration, Luke thought that she herself looked like a flower. Having picked some clover, Kenny entwined it with her companion's finger, like a ring. May happily noticed that Toller was enjoying himself. It was the first time she had seen such an expression on the executive director's face. Of course, May Kenny attributed this reaction solely to the beautiful nature and fresh air. While May, squatting, picked flowers, Luke looked at her dreamily. Then they sat peacefully, surrounded by huge boulders, by the water under a shady tree. Birds chirped around. The man and woman almost touched each other's palms. May reminded Luke of his words that she needed to take the weight off her shoulders and live more freely. She couldn't find anything better than to say in an official tone that she would follow this and wanted the director to relax too. So she was very glad that Mr. Toller agreed to the trip. Luke was dejected. He expected completely different conversations, but confirmed that he had never had so much fun before. Suddenly, large drops of rain began to drum on the leaves, falling more and more frequently, and a downpour quickly began. Luke shouted that he needed to run faster. Climbing the slippery boulders covered with lichen was difficult and dangerous. May lagged behind. Toller turned around and shouted to her to be careful. May absent-mindedly agreed. Luke looked at her angrily. He did not think to offer his hand. Toller waited while Kenny stood up, trying to hold the rising hem and grab the huge stone with her other hand. Suddenly, the hand slipped. Fortunately, Luke managed to grab it. The woman hung over the cliff, trying to find support or grab something with her free hand. Luke was afraid of not being able to hold May Kenny, and at the same time could not tear himself away from her neckline. After a few seconds, he thought of shouting to May to hold on to his hand. Kenny was grateful. She didn't realize on her own that she needed to hold on to Toller herself. The woman's hair, having lost much of her self-control, was completely wet. Her dress was stuck to her body, and her eyes were reacting to Luke's longing gaze and his attractive features. Holding May's hand tightly, Toller pulled her towards him and pulled her out. He thought it was crazy, of course. His thought related to the downpour. Taking off the shirt he was wearing over his t-shirt, Luke covered himself and his companion. It was more comfortable for the two of them to walk under such a canopy, holding each other's hands and holding the edges of the shirt with their outer hands. Having reached the bus stop, the companions exhaled with relief and laughed. Kenny sat down on the bench. Toller chose to stand. Sitting, May lowered her head and huddled in her wet dress, clinging to her body, which seemed terribly cute and seductive to Luke. Standing practically with his back to his companion, only turning his head in her direction, Toller nevertheless could not take his ardent gaze from her, which moved first higher and then lower along her figure. May did not understand this strange look and looked back with a stern question in her eyes, although there was something defenseless in her gaze. Luke wrung out and shook out the shirt and put it on May, saying that he would cover it for a while, and soon the driver Kemp would come and pick them up. Toller devoured his companion with his eyes, but did not dare to kiss. Kenny only realized that the leader looked chilled. She was afraid to admit to herself the possibility of some feelings. May was sincerely worried that the executive director was colder than she was, and at the most inopportune moment, she asked if he was okay. The director turned away. His face turned very red. The grandson of the head of the corporation said that he was fine. On the contrary, he felt hot after they ran. Miss Kenny touched the manager's forehead and noticed that his temperature had risen. May worriedly said that it was impossible for the director to catch a cold. Luke was angered by her official concern. Kenny resolutely gave the boss his shirt so that he wouldn't get cold any further. Luke had a strange feeling that he seemed to be about to fall through the ground. A car with Susan Toller and the driver Kemp pulled up to the stop. Susan was horrified why her brother and his assistant were so wet and ordered them to quickly get into the car, John seemed strangely pleased, looking at his companions sitting on the bench. As the four of them drove along the wet road, Luke's sister said that the rain came suddenly. It was not according to the forecast, and that his brother and May were probably very surprised. Susan asked why they went so far. May replied that they just wanted to see the surroundings. Toller and Kenny were sitting next to each other in the back seat, part of which was occupied by a large box of groceries. When the car went over a speed bump, the man's and woman's knees accidentally touched. Still looking out the window, Luke clenched his fist nervously. May chatted politely with Susan about her and Kemp's trip to the store. At the boarding house, having changed clothes and dried off, Luke and May began to help Susan and John prepare dinner. Standing with a bowl of lettuce leaves, Luke watched as May diligently chopped the garlic, looking focused but not stern. After some time, most were already sitting at the table. Only John Kemp was cheerfully and diligently turning over the barbecue. Luke stood thoughtfully with his fork over his unfinished plate. The women were watching something on the internet through Susan's smartphone, joking and laughing. Then it was decided to play a board game. Everyone except Luke Toller played and had fun. Luke sat with his hands on his knees and just watched the progress of the game. He watched even more closely at May, who was looking at the playing board with interest, her swan neck stretched out.